What's going on, everybody? My name is Ethan and I am a CFI in training. It's been a minute since I did my CFI training and it's still a couple more days until my CFI check ride, so let's see if I still got it. In today's video, we're going to be talking about airworthiness requirements. This is task B of the Private Pilot Airman Certification Standards. And in today's video, we're just going to go through all these different knowledge areas, starting with the general airworthiness requirements and compliance for airplanes, moving on to preventative maintenance, the equipment requirements, and then standard and special airworthiness certificates. So typically I write out every single point, or I try to write down some of the points, but there's just a lot of points right here to write down. So we're just going to look at the ACS as our reference and then come back to it. So we're going to start with the general airworthiness requirements, starting with the location and expiration dates of required aircraft certificates. So to start out, we need to understand what our required certificates are. So that is where we use this thing right here, which is ARROW. That's just our memory aid for it. And ARROW stands for we need to have our airworthiness certificate, we need to have our registration, we need to have a radio license if we plan on flying internationally, we need to have operation limitations and weight and balance. So what does all that stuff mean? Well, an airworthiness certificate, it's a certificate that is, it just says standard airworthiness certificate or special airworthiness certificate. It's typically a white little ticket that you have, and it's got to be visible to all passengers. And this airworthiness certificate does not ever expire. There's no time limit on it. It just becomes invalid if you don't comply with the necessary maintenance requirements or anything like that. So the next thing is our registration. The registration, there's two different kinds. You have a federal or a state. A federal registration is valid for 7 years and a state is valid for 1 year. The radio license, like we said, that's just for if you're flying internationally. I've never flown internationally, so I know that you have to go up and sign up for it online, but other than that, I don't necessarily know what's required. And then the operation limitations and weight and balance are found in either your pilot's operating handbook, your POH, or your aircraft flight manual, your AFM, depending on what aircraft you have. But that is all supposed to be inside your aircraft, and if you don't have those, your aircraft is not airworthy, which means it's not legal to fly in the FAA's eyes. So the next thing is the required inspections and airplane logbook documentation. So that is where we use this little acronym right here, which this is helpful, AAV8. So AAV1ATE. So the A stands for airworthiness directives. Airworthiness directives are this thing, it's kind of like a recall on your car where the FAA realizes that with this specific make and model of plane, there's been a safety hazard. And what they do is there's a bunch of different steps. There's called what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking, where they say, hey, there's this rule that needs to be made, and then they have a discussion time, and then they have what's called a final rule, where people have discussed what the possible fixes could be for the safety issue and everything like that. Then they make in their final rule what actions you have to take. And then there's two different validities to it. So you can either have a one-time or a recurring airworthiness directive. So one time just means I do it once and I'm good. Recurring means I have a certain amount of time interval that I need to comply with this airworthiness directive, and if I don't, then I am not good to fly. One very common example of that is in old Cessnas. They had seat tracks so that, like, if you're a little too tall or a little too short in your seat, you could slide forward or back, and they would get cracks in them. And then when people would pitch up, their seat would slide all the way back and people wouldn't even be able to reach the controls. So they had an airworthiness directive come out that said you need to get your seat tracks fixed. And that's one of those things where if that didn't happen, your plane was not airworthy. The next is your annual inspection. This is done every 12 calendar months, and you'll hear me say calendar months from here on out. That just means if let's say that today, the 18th of January, I had something done and I had my annual inspection done. In calendar months, if it's 12 calendar months, that means next year it's not valid until the 18th of January. It's actually valid until the 31st, the very end of that month. So that's an entire calendar month. It's the very end of that month. So that, like we said, is 12 calendar months. Your VOR inspection is every 30 days, and that is for IFR rated aircraft only. So if you're a plane that's not IFR rated, you don't need to do it. The 100 hour, that's for if your aircraft is for hire. So if there's like flight instruction going on in it, that is considered for hire. You need to get a 100-hour inspection, which is done every 100 hours. Then we have the altimeter and pedostatic system, which deals with our instruments. That's done every 24 calendar months. The transponder, I just put TX for short because it was kind of hard to write all this stuff out on MS Paint, but it is every 24 calendar months. And then your ELT, emergency locator transmitter, which is essentially just a little thing in your plane that if you have a hard landing, or let's say that I had an emergency landing and hit the ground real hard, it would start beeping and doing swoops on the emergency frequency so that it would let everybody know that, hey, there's an emergency aircraft going on, and it helps with location. It transmits so that you can be located by search and rescue. So the ELT is needing to be inspected every 12 calendar months, and the battery of the ELT actually needs to change either after a half of the battery's life or an hour of cumulative use. So every time that the ELT is used, it's written down how long it was used for in a little log, and then after an hour of use, you have to change that battery, or half the battery life. Typically, that's just a date that the person who manufactures the ELT puts on it, letting you know, hey, that's when half the battery life is. So after that, we have special airworthiness information bulletins, and those are essentially just like, they just alert you or give you information, or give you recommendations in the aviation industry. They're not regulatory like an airworthiness directive is. You have to comply with an airworthiness directive, but a special airworthiness information bulletin is just that. It's just giving you information. Then we have what's called a special flight permit. So let's say that I had a plane that is overdue on its maintenance. It's been in there for real long. It's been real old. We can get what's called a special flight permit. So even if my plane is not technically airworthy by the FAA, if I apply for this, then I can transport this plane from where I'm at to get the maintenance done. So there's a few different reasons for that. One of them is, like we said, flying an aircraft to a base of maintenance when it can't get done where I'm at. If I was getting the aircraft away from impending danger, so let's say there was a hurricane coming in and I'm in Florida, maybe I could fly it away. Or if I was production flight testing a new aircraft that had just come out, not gotten its airworthiness certificate yet, I could get a special flight permit to do that flight and test it. Customer demonstration flight, if I worked for somebody and was trying to sell a plane. If I wanted to deliver or export an aircraft, that's another reason. And then the last reason is if I was going to operate at a weight higher than the max certificated takeoff weight, I would have to get a special flight permit for that. But those essentially are just one of those things that if you're in a flight training environment, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of experience with that, because flight schools typically take really good care of their aircraft. But just knowing that a special flight permit is what you'd get if your plane is not airworthy and you're trying to move it somewhere, then you are good there. And if you want to ever apply for a special flight permit, it's your Flight Standards District Office, or FSDO for short. And you can honestly just look up online how to obtain a special flight permit, and the FAA has a publication that just walks you right through it. So the owner and operator and pilot and command responsibilities. So owner and operator, their job is to make sure that the plane is getting its required inspections. So if I own a plane, I need to make sure that it's getting its inspections done. But let's say that I'm renting a plane from somewhere. If I'm the pilot in command, the PIC, I still have the responsibility to check their work. I have the responsibility to make sure, hey, this maintenance is complied with, or hey, I see all the required documents, or whatever it may be. That is something that you need to do as a pilot, and you need to familiarize yourself with, because you're going to always be doing that. You know, just familiarize yourself with the maintenance logs or anything like that, because you'll get asked it on any check ride that you have. So the next thing is pilot performed preventative maintenance. So that is actually straight from a regulation. That is 14 CFR Part 43. So Part 43 has a couple of what are called appendixes to it. So Appendix A is what we're looking at, and then we go down to Subpart C. So B is major repairs, C is preventative maintenance. This literally just lists out every single thing that we can do as a pilot to, like, maintenance-wise, without getting it done by a professional mechanic. So if I wanted to remove, install, or repair landing gear, tires, anything like that, I could do that. You can just read down through that list, and it lists them all in pretty plain English. One thing with that, I'm not necessarily fully confident in doing those things. So if I was ever questioning it, I probably just wouldn't do it, because I don't want to do something incorrectly and then think I'm safe and have an issue when I'm starting flying. But that's obviously your prerogative, but I would always err on the side of safety. So next we have the equipment requirements for day and night VFR, and that has a lot of different things that we need to memorize. I know there's a lot of words on the screen here. We'll go through them kind of quick, but this is pulled straight from 14 CFR 91205. So 91205, it lists out every single equipment or instrument that we need to fly in visual flight rules during the day, in visual flight rules at night, or in instrument flight rules. Since we're trying to get our private pilot's license, we're solely going to focus on the visual flight rules during the day and at night, but this is where I'm deriving this information from. So this is just a good way to remember them. So for the visual flight rules in the daytime, it's a bad circle, in the daytime, we use what's called tomato flames. So A stands for airspeed indicator, T, tachometer, which is just the RPM gauge, and it sees how much hours are on the engine. That's we need one for each engine. So if we're in a multi-engine plane, we need 2 tachometers. Oil pressure gauge, manifold pressure gauge, which those are a lot less common in flight training aircraft. But if you ever have like a constant speed propeller or any sort of altitude engine like a turboprop or anything like that, you will need a manifold pressure gauge. But if not, you don't need it. An altimeter, you need a temperature gauge for liquid-cooled engines or an oil temperature gauge for air-cooled engines. You need a fuel gauge, a landing gear position lights. So if you have a aircraft that the landing gear comes up and down, you need position lights that are working. Anti-collision lights, magnetic compass, the ELT, and then seat belts. Those are all the required equipment that you need to fly in the day. So if I go out to my plane and my altimeter's not working, my plane is no longer airworthy. I need to get it fixed in order for it to be legal to fly. The next is the nighttime. So for nighttime, it's a little bit easier. We need not only these 5 night things in flaps, but we also need a tomato flames for nighttime. So we need all of these, all of this stuff in this area, and all of this stuff in this area to be airworthy to fly at night. So in addition to the tomato flames, we need fuses. We need 3 of a kind or a full set. So what that means essentially is that there's certain amperages that a fuse can take. So if it gets to a certain amp threshold, then that fuse pops, or it busts or blows out, and you need either a full set, so 1 for each, or you need 3 of a kind. So let's say that there's a bunch of different equipment that blows at 3 amps, then you need 3 3-amp fuses, and on and on and on. Then we have a landing light. That's for if our aircraft is for hire, again, like flight instruction. Anti-collision lights, which are, again, our strobe lights or our beacon. Position lights, which are the red and green wingtip lights. And then a source of power that's adequate for the extra electric stuff that's going to be running. So because at nighttime we have to have extra lights on, we have to have our position lights on, we have to have our strobe lights on, our landing light on, and our inside the cockpit lights, our map light, floodlight, all that stuff. It's important for us to have a good enough source of power that can power all of those new electric components. So that is another requirement. Then we have flying with inoperative equipment. So when it comes to flying with inoperative equipment, there's a few things that we use to help us with that decision making, because it's always a tricky thing. You know, if I went out to my plane and I realized that, hey, this instrument is not working or this thing is not working, I always need to go through the necessary steps to make sure, hey, am I legal? Am I safe to fly? So I pull this straight from Advisory Circular 9167 Alpha. But this gives a PIC decision sequence. So this tells us exactly what we need to do. So before we get into that, we're going to discuss a few things, which are our MEL and our KOEL. So there's little difference between an MEL and a KOEL. The main thing is just what planes they're used for. So a KOEL we'll start with, because it's the simpler one, starts with, it means kinds of operation equipment list. So that's typically in our smaller aircraft, because in smaller aircraft there's not a crazy amount of components. So this will say, okay, at nighttime you need these specific instruments, this specific equipment, or at daytime you need these specific instruments, this specific equipment. And if any of those things that are in the KOEL are broken or are missing or anything like that, the aircraft is not airworthy. But on the flip side, a minimum equipment list is for your bigger planes, you know, like if I'm on a Boeing 737 or any form of airliner. They have so many different things on them, so many different equipments, so many different components that are on the aircraft. So if they had a list of the specific required things for each flight, it would be so long. So instead of listing out the things that have to be working, a minimum equipment list lists out all the things that can be broken and you still fly. That's why it's called the minimum equipment list. So it lists out the things that can be broken and I'm still good to fly. And that helps out when you have a plane with so many components, because it's very easy for one or two of them to be broken. It just knows which are really necessary for a safe flight and which aren't. So now that we know what an MEL and KOEL are, we can go through this decision sequence. So like it says, you locate that an instrument or equipment item is discovered to be inoperative before takeoff. We note it in the maintenance records. Then we see if the MEL or the KOEL is it good. So when it says deferred, it's like if I look at my KOEL and my flaps are not working right now. If I look at my KOEL and it doesn't say anything about flaps, then it's fine. So if it's not in our KOEL, then we're good to keep going. Then if it was in our KOEL, we would have to repair the item before takeoff. And then we just go down through step by step. We go through our MEL or KOEL. Then we go through our atomato flames and flaps. We look at airworthiness directives. We look at our supplemental type certificate. We look at all of these different things that list out the equipment in our plane and what's necessary. And if we go through all of those and it doesn't list that item, then we do the most important part, the safety risk analysis. So if we know that we're good by the books, we then need to check, am I safe? Will I be safe if I do this flight with this thing inoperative? And if I determine that the answer is no, then I don't fly. I get it repaired. But if I determine that the answer is yes, I go through and do what's called placarding it in op, and then I deactivate it. So placarding it in op essentially just means that I put something on it that says that it's inoperative, and then deactivating it is typically something that you wouldn't know how to do. So you would have to take that to maintenance to make it so that it's deactivated, so that you don't try to use it and it not be working. But then the thing that always happens in my mind is it's like, well, if you're going to take it to maintenance to deactivate it, why wouldn't you just take it for them to fix it, you know? So I don't really know any situation where that would be unless if it's something that like that A&P just couldn't do it for some reason. So, but yeah, that is what you would do there. And then the last thing is just standard and special airworthiness certificates and their associated operational limitations. So a standard airworthiness certificate, it's white. It says standard airworthiness certificate on the top of it. That's the one that we talked about before. That's most aircraft. But where it gets a little different is a special airworthiness certificate. And a special airworthiness certificate, essentially, it's just a little pink, like it's pink. And this plane, if it's got a pink airworthiness certificate, it's used for pleasure only. You can't transport people or property for compensation or hire. You can't do anything like that. So that's the difference. I can make money if I'm on a, if I'm certificated well enough and if I have a standard airworthiness certificate. But if it's a special airworthiness certificate, you cannot carry persons or property for compensation or hire. And those are typically, the pink certificates are typically given to your aircraft, like the home built aircraft and things like that, as opposed to, a manufactured aircraft that's typically being flown everywhere. So the most important thing that we want to think about here is the inoperative equipment discovered prior to flight. I would really encourage you to look through 9167 Alpha. It's got a couple different flows. This one right here, if you go up a little bit too, there's this one, the PIC decision sequence, and this lists out actually the exact regulations you're looking to, 91213D2. So we can go through it one more time. We see the inoperative equipment. We make an entry in the maintenance records. Is it required under 91213D? Has the maintenance action required by that occurred? If yes, conduct a safety risk analysis. And then through here, this one's really helpful. You can just get on here, 91213D, and it just tells you step by step how that decision sequence is. And the reason that you can, and it's important to memorize kind of how that flow goes, but the reason that you don't solely want to go off of that is because if I were to go out, see that there's something wrong with my plane, I would never want to just go off memory, because I don't ever want to fly an unsafe or illegally operated aircraft. So it's important to just always go back through, look at this advisory circular 9167 Alpha, go through 91213, go through the 91205, which is just the required equipment for day and night. Go through all of those things and make sure, am I good to fly? Am I covering my bases? Have I done everything to conduct this flight in a safe manner? That is all that I have for you guys, and thank you for watching.